If everyone could add their affiliation either on their name or in the chat, we would appreciate it. I'm Carrie Flaherty-Wallia. I'm the restoration ecologist here with the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, and I'm going to turn it over to Allison Patronella, who is one of our co-chairs of the Habitat Restoration Consortium, to introduce our speakers.
Hi, everyone. I'm Allison. Unfortunately, Ryan was unable to make it today, so it'll just be me and Carrie. Our first speaker is going to be Whitney Costner from Manatee County Natural Resource Department, and she's going to be talking to us about Perico Preserve and about some mangrove heart attacks. So, Whitney, if you'd like to start sharing your screen.
And we can do that either way, Whitney, and for all our speakers, if you would like to share on your own, you can do that, or I have your presentations and I can drive for you. Whatever way you prefer.
I'm not able to hear you, Whitney.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank goodness. Actually, Sherry is going to start with a couple of slides, and then I will continue, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Sherry, I can share my screen and I can drive.
Great.
Someone else is sharing, send request. Sorry,
Yeah.
technology. I feel like such a dinosaur.
Okay, you should be good to go.
All right.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, you can. Yay.
Woo.
I've been saying that for a while, so I'm glad you can finally hear me. All right. Are you sharing the screen?
Can everyone see my screen? It's got Perico Preserve Mangrove Heart Attack or Mangrove Habitat Restoration Project.
I don't see it up yet. Go ahead and
Okay.
try and share again.
How about now? How about now? Why is this hard? Share. How about now?
There, it's coming.
Good grief. Okay.
There it is.
All right. So I'm just going to introduce, we're excited to join you today to discuss the Perico Preserve Mangrove Habitat Restoration Project, which was supported by funding through the Tampa Bay Estuary Program. The project included mangrove restoration within a 120-acre mangrove forest located at Perico Preserve that, as you'll learn today, has been experiencing a large mangrove die-off, otherwise known as a mangrove heart attack. Joining me today is our Natural Resources Department project team, Whitney Costner, who served as a project manager, and she'll be presenting today, and Josh Menendez, who supported us during construction. Slide 2. In 2022, Manatee County was awarded a grant through the Tampa Bay Environmental Restoration Fund totaling $150,000. This funding was matched by an additional $150,000 from Manatee County, bringing the project total to $300,000. After navigating numerous internal challenges and policy changes, we executed an agreement with the Tampa Bay Estuary Program in 2023 to begin the project. The project was structured into 4 phases. The first phase focused on baseline data collection to better understand existing and historic hydrologic modifications. The second phase used that data to develop recommendations, adjusting carefully to determine where we could make the most restoration impact within our available budget. The third phase included final restoration design and permitting, and the fourth was construction, which was completed this March 30th. As Whitney will discuss, challenges like adjacent private property constraints that prevented full-scale restoration, permitting concerns, and limited funding required us to do a multi-step project approach. Today, we'll discuss the first project and show how we were able to maximize restoration benefits to this failing mangrove system while staying within our budget.
Okay, this is where I take over. So to familiarize everyone, Perico Preserve is located in West Manatee County at this pink star right here. And I'm going to use this laser pointer to kind of point things out. So follow that. Okay, so Perico Preserve is a 176-acre coastal conservation area located on Perico Island on Manatee Ave, west of Bradenton and east of Anna Maria Island. It was once degraded farmland, which was acquired by Manatee County in 2007 and has since been restored into a diverse landscape of coastal wetlands, uplands, scrub habitats. The mangrove project that we'll be speaking about today is west of the restoration area in this oval. So although much of Perico Preserve has been successfully restored, the mangrove forest faces challenges that affect its long-term health. So since 2015, some areas have shown signs of hydrologic stress and decline. These issues were first identified in 2016 and then later confirmed in 2020 to as what's known as a mangrove heart attack. So this happens when prolonged flooding limits oxygen exchange through the mangrove's aerial roots, leading to stress and tree death. There's an example of tree stress right here. You see the lots of impounding, stressed trees, and then obviously this is the mortality. So as the mangroves decline, the underlying peat can also collapse, which worsens flooding and makes natural recovery more difficult without restoring proper water flow. It's important to note that this is not unique to Perico Preserve. There's similar die-off events happening all over Florida and around the world, often linked to restricted hydrology and climate-related stress. So overall, these events show that mangrove heart attacks are part of a broader pattern tied to challenges in water flow and environmental conditions. And just to reiterate, this project was funded by the Tampa Bay Environmental Restoration Fund with 4 different phases, one being baseline data collection, then restoration design, final restoration design and permits, and then restoration implementation. So now we can get into phase 1, which is our baseline data collection. There is a lot here that we'll go through. So Manatee County worked with an environmental team at Environmental Science Associates led by Ryan Horseman to carry out the phase 1 baseline data collection. This phase had 2 main components: to analyze aerial imagery and LiDAR-based topography and collecting hydrologic data in our project area. The team evaluated drainage patterns, landscape changes, and how the site has evolved over time. So to support this analysis, short-term hydrologic monitoring was conducted across the main die-off areas. This included measuring water levels, tidal patterns, and temperature using monitoring equipment installed in field wells. Together, these efforts provided a clear understanding of the driving factors contributing to mangrove stress and mortality. So looking at current conditions during our phase 1, the 2023 aerial mapping shows that we have 9.5 acres of complete mangrove mortality and 2.6 acres of stressed and thinning trees. So the central die-off area is the most impacted, accounting for about 6.5 acres of mortality, and then all of the 2.6 acres of thinning trees that we mapped. In this northern area, this is about 2 acres of mortality, and this little guy here in the south is about 0.7 acres. The map also shows hydrologic modifications over time, including all of these mosquito ditching, the berm ditch on both of these boundaries, and then these drainage structures associated with the Harbor Isle community on the western boundary of the mangroves. And on the left, I wanted to include this because this kind of covers up the signatures that you find when looking at aerial imagery of the die-off. And so this is what they kind of look like. They have this tannin stained, almost kind of pinkish color to them, and this open water essentially. So now we're going to look at a series of images to see how the landscape has changed over time. This little arrow here is kind of keep you oriented as we move through the series. So at the time at Perico on the island, it was largely undeveloped with natural habitats like coastal pine flatwoods. We've got some salt barrens. Please keep this in mind when we move to the next image, and mangrove habitat. The main man-made structures is the predecessor to what is now State Road 64, and then some agricultural activities. That's southeast of Perico. So this set of images is from 1948 to 1958. So during this time, obviously, much of the pine flatwoods has been converted to agriculture. Same over here. You can also see that this ditch berm system is now in place on either side. This berm ditch goes nowhere. Neither does this one. They just end right here. And you can see that the salt barrens are now degraded. State Road 64 has been improved. I think that's all I wanted to show on this one. So 1973, State Road 64 has been further improved, essentially cutting off drainage southward into Anna Maria Sound. Citrus groves in Perico appear to be fallow. And the most notable changes, of course, are the mangrove or the mosquito ditching all throughout here, which is the signatures of those linear channels with the spoil on either side of those. Okay. So the 2008 imagery shows significant development and land use change around Perico. Sorry about that. With early development of what is now Harbor Isles. So all of this here was an ag, and now we've got these excavated wetlands and all this land moving, earth moving. There's also a hydrologic cut that's hard to see right here that I think is connected to these ponds that drains. There's I believe, a drainage easement into Perico. So all of this drains down into the mangrove forest. However, despite all of these pressures, the mangrove forest appears to be unchanged, and we really don't detect any mangrove stress, no stressed trees, or any mortality in the forest. Whoops. So in 2012, the imagery shows visible progress at Harbor Isles, where the first buildings are being constructed. You can see a lot more water that's kind of gathering here. You can also see that Manatee County has started phase 1 of the restoration project at Perico Preserve with excavation of the freshwater and saltwater ponds and other earth-moving activities. So this is where you can kind of begin to see some stress in the mangrove system. This little pond right here, you can kind of see that tannic signature that's starting to kind of halo from that little isolated pond, and just a little bit here as well. So here we'll focus on the central die-off area, which is the primary focus of our project. It tracks the changes over the next 10 years. So by 2015, you can see that the stress and mortality is starting to expand here as well, here, here, and then where we are today. It's difficult to pinpoint the exact tipping point of kind of what kind of set this trajectory of stress in the system. But it's important to note that our local area has experienced multiple named storms, including that's brought extreme winds, heavy rainfall, storm surge, like starting from this period. Hurricane Hermine in 2016, Irma in 2017, Ian in 22, Idalia in 2023, and then Helene and Milton in 2024. So storm surge can be especially damaging and problematic when mangroves when the hydrology has been altered, because it's limiting the system's ability to maintain regular tidal exchange. So while mangroves are generally resilient, repeated exposure like we've had over the past 10 years can contribute to ongoing stress, and as we can see. The topographic data highlights the locations of ditches and berms within and around the mangrove forest. Tidal exchange, this is going to be kind of a slow one because it's hard to pick all of this out, but you can see that there's adequate tidal exchange here under State Road 64 with these lower elevation colors. Enough water, and I've seen this myself, enough water flow gets through there to kind of scour and keep this area relatively open. Same for this tidal creek here that's holding on for dear life. But then you can see with the yellow and green coloration that the elevations are raising in these areas. There's some modeling in here. This is our central die-off area. You can even see some of that bluer signature, which indicates even lower elevations, which is not surprising knowing what's going on there, because peak collapse is a signature or hallmark of these mangrove heart attacks, which exacerbates the flooding and impounding. Also, you can see this higher elevation here, and here is the berm complex, and then this lower elevation of yellow that is parallel to the berm is the ditch, the peripheral ditch, rim ditch. And you can see about right here, south of our die-off area, it begins to really narrow and constrict. And again, there's a lot of storm debris down here. It's just overgrown with pneumatophores and biomass. The field portion of phase 1 was a hydrologic assessment looking at water level dynamics, tidal connectivity, and environmental conditions in each die-off area, comparing them to regional tide data. And these are the monitoring stations. So one here at the south in the ditch, one in the central mangrove die-off area, and then one up here in this area to the north. So for the sake of time, we'll focus on the central die-off area where the conditions are most degraded. The graph here shows our local measurements over the course of the study period, which was from June to October, in yellow, compared to the NOAA tide data from St. Pete, which is the blue. And that red line is our ground elevation in the mangrove area. This site remained flooded throughout the monitoring period, with average water depths around 1/2 foot or 6 inches, and show minimal response to tidal fluctuations. As you can see, it's overlain. It's flooded all the time, and it does not adequately drain. Temperature data is not shown. It indicates that shallow open water of the die-off areas experience greater solar heating, not surprising, and extreme fluctuations compared to the shaded areas. Field observations reinforce these findings, Sediments in the die-off zone are firmer and lower in organic matter. Pneumatophore density is greatly reduced, and seedlings are absent. Overall, our data show that restricted tidal exchange, poor drainage, prolonged inundation, and elevated temperatures are key factors contributing to mangrove stress and mortality. So that brings us to phase 2. What do we do? What's our design? How do we fix this? So Manatee County hired an environmental consultant at Stantec to move forward with the remaining phases of the project, starting with field investigations to explore ways to reduce impoundment and improve tidal flushing. These investigations revealed that restoration opportunities are limited by several factors, including, and I don't think I pointed this out before, that was a mistake. I'll go back really quick because it's important. Manatee County doesn't own this. This out parcel is privately owned out parcel. So we don't own this. The preserve is here and then all of this. That's important for restoration design. So that private parcel blocks opportunities for a tidal creek restoration, so large scale restoration to really kind of improve things throughout the entire mangrove forest. We've got development along the western boundary, which is Harbor Isles, extensive mosquito ditching, the boundary berms, and restricted potential for southward tidal flow because of State Road 64. Also, we only had $150,000 to construct the project, so we had some funding limitations. So given these physical and funding constraints, large-scale restoration isn't feasible. Instead, with the funding and the time and all of this for this project, the project focused on strategic, targeted habitat improvements, such as reducing localized impoundment and supporting landward mangrove migration into Perico Preserve. The plan was to, 1, improve a portion of the existing north-south berm and a remnant spoil. And 2, to selectively clear ditches of accumulated detritus and overgrown mangrove prop roots and pneumatophores using hand tools. Sorry. So it brings us to phase 3. Phase 2 was short there, but it was a long process. I'll have to tell you that, trying to figure out what we're going to do. So, but it's quick in here, but I have to emphasize that phase 2 was a challenge, just trying to find what to do. I digress. Key actions include excavating a section of the north-south berm to create a shallow channel that reconnects the impacted mangroves to an adjacent ditch. So here is the berm area, and right about here is where we chose to do that berm removal to enhance tidal exchange. The breach is positioned at a former agriculture ditch, shown here, linking the marsh to the north-south ditch, the marsh being within Perico Preserve, which will support mangrove migration into the preserve, enhancing ecosystem resilience. Excavated material will be reused on site to raise elevations in degraded areas. Right here was the permitted area where we could locate that soil to encourage natural mangrove recolonization. Additionally, a small spoil will be removed to restore flow and maintain connection into this already existing berm breach that goes into the ditch. So spoil mound here, and then the recipient area here. To enhance flushing, targeted clearing took place in 3 key ditches. The former agriculture ditch, so we could get landward migration of the mangroves, into the north-south ditch, and then also enhancing these connections, and then into the mosquito ditch that goes to the 60-inch culvert underneath State Road 64. The work included clearing detritus, removing red mangrove prop roots, and reducing black mangrove nematophores, improving water movement while minimizing impacts to the mangroves. This work covered 3,000 linear feet and will connect the mangrove die-off areas to support landward mangrove migration and promote natural recovery. No mangrove trees were removed or excavated. No mitigation was required for this project. Bringing us to construction. Construction began on February 3rd with earth balance starting ditch clearing work. The selected ditches offer the most direct route to the 16-inch culvert, avoiding excavation that could harm mangroves. Only secondary and tertiary red mangrove prop roots were trimmed, and overgrown black mangrove nematophores were only removed where needed to improve flow. Detritus was cleared to natural grade and side cast on the berm to decompose, limiting repeated foot traffic in and out of the work area and the use of heavy equipment. And the shortest path from the staging area to the ditches was chosen to minimize impacts to all our salt marsh. Sorry. Photo documentation was conducted throughout the 3,000 linear foot ditch clearing area to ensure all enhancement activities remained within the scope of authorized work. Sorry, providing a visual record of compliance and proper implementation. So I'm going to show just some select photos. At PS5, I wanted to show this photo because this was an existing berm breach into the ditch. This is a good area to view. And then PS6 shows a challenging area that we had to clear in the north-south ditch. All right, sorry for the fuzzy photos. These before and after photos of PS5 are facing west into the die-off area, the southern part of the central die-off area. This improved channel will help direct water from the die-off area into the adjacent ditch. Work in this section, I think, is obvious. It was a very labor-intensive in trimming the prop roots, but more so removing detritus and nematophores to natural ground. This is a PS6 facing south down the ditch. This section had loads of storm debris. As you can see, it's almost unrecognizable that it's the same part of the ditch. When this work was, the design was made, that was before Hurricane Milton and Helene, and all of the storm debris was not there before, or not to this level. So when we got down to this ditch, when it was time to construct, it was a little surprising about how much storm debris we had to contend with. Unforeseeable challenges. Manatee County hired Rick Richards to complete a berm removal and sediment redistribution portion of the project. A 35-foot section of the north-south berm was excavated, creating a shallow channel that reconnects the central mangrove die-off area to the adjacent ditch, which is close to that agricultural ditch that leads into the salt marsh of Perico Preserve. Excavated sediments were placed in nearby degraded areas to raise elevations and support natural mangrove recolonization. So this area here obviously looks into the die-off area, which is here. This is where translocation of the sediments were. So in this area, no, we did not bury any nematophores. And this is the channel. Here is the adjacent ditch. So kind of, if you can envision it looking like that, it doesn't swoop, obviously. Additionally, Rick Richards removed a small spoil that was blocking connectivity between the die-off area, that southern portion of, or no, never mind, not the southern portion, sorry, of the die-off area and the existing berm breach. Excavated material were cast in a thin layer and designated recipient area to maintain flow through the mangroves. So it was here. I didn't get a good before photo, but it was at elevation 3 in a VD 88. Now it's at 1, and you can see water is able, this was kind of a dry down period, obviously. But you can see that, the water is able to channel through here as well as here. This is a more direct path. So this was pretty critical component to getting water out of here. So construction is complete as of March 30th. We are waiting completion of our as-built survey, and we are going to close out this project mid-May on time. So now with restoration complete, the next step is to monitor how the mangrove system responds. This is not part of the project, but something obviously we want to do. Not part of the project funded by TBRF, but that obviously we're interested in. So to assess the health and recovery potential of the mangroves, several monitoring approaches may be implemented. Abby Tierna of the Suncoast Waterkeepers, through the Mangrove Ranger program, is documenting annual changes in the central die-off area using drone imagery. Initial flights were in August of 2025, which established a baseline canopy condition, and subsequent annual surveys will take place to track changes in mangrove extent, growth, and structural development over time. I don't have the results of that yet. Abby's going to share that with me as soon as her intern can process that data. We may also repeat the water level monitoring that was done at the baseline, during the baseline, to evaluate the improvements of the tidal flushing, and we may conduct periodic field surveys to track natural recruitment, particularly within the areas that were elevated with that translocated material, that hopefully will, support natural recruitment. And looking ahead, way ahead, we've got visions of designing a larger Tidal Creek restoration if and when we can gain ownership of that out parcel in the north area. And if and when we do, we'll be looking to secure funding to make that happen. And with that, I want to thank all these people and TBRF, of course. I'm sorry if I'm over time. There's just so much to go through. Was it bad?
It was incredibly interesting. Thank you for sharing. Carrie, do we have time for some questions?
Yeah, why don't maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll move on to our next.
All right, if anyone has a question, you can write it in the chat or raise your hand.
Oops.
Yes, Maya.
So I was just gonna ask, Manatee County, do y'all do like guided hikes after you conduct a restoration project like this? I know like some people do them after like a burn, for example, to sort of inform the community about the efforts that have been undertaken. Do you guys do that? Would you be interested in partnering on something like that in the future?
I don't know a lot of people that like to go tromp around in the mangroves, but I would love to show off this work. It's really difficult to capture it in the photos. So I don't want to speak for Manatee County, but I think there would be some interest there, especially with our partners at the Estuary program. You guys are probably mangrove trompers.
I think there's like a whole market. Clyde Butcher has shown that people are willing to do more than you think. But you just have to advertise it accordingly, right? I'll hit you up.
Okie doke.
All right. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in. So if y'all have questions for Whitney, please leave them in the chat and she can get back to you there. And with that, we will transition to our next speaker, who is Rebecca Delp from Cummings Edinburgh. And she's going to be talking to us about the the tire reef feasibility study that was done off of the Skyway in mid Tampa Bay. So, Rebecca?
Yes. Hi. I think I'm sharing. Can we see my screen?
Yes, you're sharing. We can see it.
Okay. So let me get in presentation mode here. Okay. Still seeing that okay?
Yep, we can see it good.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. Like she said, my name is Rebecca Delp. I'm with Cummins Cedarburg, and we've been working with TBEP on a artificial tire reef project, looking at the kind of feasibility of what the options are for remediation or restoration of the reef. So just to start with a little bit of background, the Tire Reef location is just about 1.5 miles south of Pinellas Point here, east of the Skyway Bridge. You can see our specific survey area in the red right here, but it's located within lower Tampa Bay there. And just some background info on what we know on the reef. We have a kind of slew of historical documents that we were able to review and look through. And so there were a lot of artificial reefs deployed in the coastal waters of Florida between the 60s and 80s. This one specifically, which we're just referring to, the Tampa Bay Tire Reef, was authorized in 1966 and then installed shortly thereafter. And the city of St. Pete was the one that implemented this project. And so per the permit documents, the reef area was authorized to be about 1,000 feet long and 150 feet wide. So about 3.4 acres. And the substrate that was authorized to be deployed at the reef was primarily tires, but there were some concrete and or clay pipes also allowable through the permit authorizations. And basically, these tires were primarily installed in groups of 3. And so this is just a snip from kind of the design drawings from the permit files at that time. And so you had 3 tires. They were generally mostly the same size, although they did vary between 6 and 8 inches in width. And then what they would do is they would secure them together and then fill the bottoms of them with cement to kind of stabilize them a little bit and get them to, sink down and stay in one place, or at least that was the objective, right? And so most of these tires were deployed in, like I said, 3 units of 3 tires. And so about 4,400 tire units were deployed, or just over 13,000 individual tires. Per the permits, there was no stacking of units authorized. So it's a bit interesting. If you go back, you can see in the cross section here, they have just a typical section here. It does show what is seemingly stacking of tires, but it was in the permit description that stacking was not authorized. And so we'll get into that a little bit more as we get into what we found when we got in the water on site. But ultimately, this artificial reef was primarily implemented to enhance and provide habitat for fisheries within the Tampa Bay area, especially at the specific area where there was otherwise pretty much nothing going on down on the bay bottom. It was pretty devoid of resources. So now, obviously, we know that tires as artificial reef material are not the best option. And, they are no longer authorized to be able to be deployed. There have been removal efforts within Florida as well as, other places in the world. And their environmental concerns are widely recognized. And so those are primarily the tires kind of breaking down and degrading as they spend, decades in the water, and they're then releasing kind of microplastics and contaminants and things into the water and into the substrate, which ultimately may have an impact on marine life, potentially acute toxicity exposure, development issues, growth suppression, things like that. And so there's been a good bit of research on these tire reefs since they've been deployed, dating back to the 60s. And so, as I mentioned, their environmental concerns are pretty well recognized now. In addition to the leaching and kind of toxicity resulting from the degradation of the tires, you also have these tires just not being secured correctly or staying secured efficiently. And so as you have storms and surge and things like that come through, these tires end up getting dislodged and dispersed and potentially have impacts to surrounding habitats and things like that. So have a wider impact than just maybe the tire reefs where they were implemented. And so the idea here is that we want to implement some sort of remediation to address some of these concerns that are specifically at this tire reef. So Cummins Cedarburg was brought on to help with some of this initial planning. And so we really wanted to get a better understanding of what the Tampa Bay tire reef looked like. And so we got some updated bathymetric surveying. We did some in-water surveying as well to kind of see, what was growing on the reefs and what these tires looked like. We had some pre-application meetings with some regulatory agencies, and we are currently in the process of wrapping up a remediation plan or restoration plan to really look at what the different options are for this reef. So getting into some of the data that we collected, here is a snip of our bathymetry data that Servtech Solutions collected for us. And so they went out and got this data via vessel, collected some side scan data, which I have a snip of here soon too. But we found that water depths are between 11 feet and 15 feet. There is sort of an interesting signature at the reef. You can see there's, this ridge that sort of aligns with the right side of the reef being the black or dark blue kind of outline there. And so you have shallower water depths just on the east side of the reef of about, 10 to 11 feet. And then as you hit the reef and then move west, it drops down to about 14, 15 feet. And we started to look into what, this ridge potentially was. But looking at aerials, the ridge does kind of extend north and south well beyond the survey site. So we don't have a great answer for what that ridge is. I'd be very interested to see if anyone here has any insight. But without, really looking into that in detail and, investigating that further, we are assuming that this is some sort of natural deposition of sediment at the site. But you can see the kind of the unique signature there within the Bay Area of that ridge and kind of where it goes. So the bathymetric data, one, gave us water depth data, but also let us kind of use the side scan data to hone on to see where exactly these tires may be. And so after we got the side scan data, we did some GIS exercise to just visually look at that side scan data and kind of outline where we thought the anticipated tire reef boundaries were. And so this is just a zoomed in example of that. You can see the areas that were showing a bit more relief were outlined in these blue lines here, and ultimately are what gave us our anticipated reef boundary for planning our in-water survey work. Now, I do want to mention that there was some previous survey work done at this site and within the greater Tampa Bay region back in 2019. And so we did have that data as a sort of initial start for where this tire reef was, but kind of its boundaries that had been previously identified by CSA and TBEP. And so that is what is shown in red here. And you'll notice that it appears that the kind of main tire reef area seems to have shifted west with a potential scattering of tires to the west as well. And so our survey area was originally set up, the kind of red box there, peach colored box, was set up to capture both the main tire reef area, the main, blobs and the larger blobs in red and blue there to the left side of the survey area, but also to capture those couple of red dots that are a little bit further east that were identified to be potential tires during that time or with that survey data as well. In hindsight, noticing the amount of potential scattering to the left, we wish that survey data was maybe, or that survey area was moved a little bit further to the west. But again, we just didn't know until we knew, right? And so the initial assumption here was that the tire reef shifted to the west a bit, and we see that scattering there due to some of the larger storms that we had come through between 2019 and 2025, specifically Hilton and Helene. And so that is the blue area here is what we were looking at for our in-water survey work. We don't have, or we actually just received recently the actual side scan data from that 2019 data collection. And so haven't been able to kind of look at that a little bit closer yet to see if maybe those dispersal patterns that we're seeing to the west were there and just not identified. So it's hard to kind of compare apples to oranges when we don't know exactly how that previous to 2019 boundary was identified, or whether they even really look to extend that identification beyond kind of that main tire field area. So using that BAFI data helped us set up our planning for our in-water work. And the purpose of the in-water work was really just to get an idea of what the tires looked like, what their condition was. The goal was to get some sort of estimate or tire count within the tire reef area, and then also look at what was growing on the tires, around the tires, to see what type of benthic habitat we were looking out there. And so to do that, we split the survey area into these 50-foot grid systems, and then basically just selected representative grids for surveying. So we did have a pretty limited budget for these initial, just the whole feasibility of the project and this in-water surveying component of the project. So we were only in the field for 2 days. And so you'll see here on the screen, we had, with high anticipation of, doing as much as we possibly could, given perfect conditions and all of that, we're trying to get a good coverage of the reef. And so we had our primary day 1 cells identified in red. There's 15 of them there. And again, just kind of generally covering the full area of what we're calling the main tire reef field. And then we had our primary day 2 survey cells selected. And so those are the orange ones, again, just kind of getting a representation of specifically the scatter field on that day 2. And then we had some kind of bonus cells there highlighted in yellow, which we were, hoping to get to if we had time. And so these are the points that we actually ended up being able to get to. And so I think we had about 10 cells within the main tire reef and then within the scatter field as well. And we ended up doing basically recon swims at each cell. So we would place a weighted buoy within the center of that grid cell, go down with divers and perform radial swims around that grid cell to kind of see what that cell was encompassing and what was in there. And so for the main tire field cells, we had started with radial swims at 25 meters or 25 feet and 50 feet. And then at the scattered field cells, we ended up just doing S swims up and down with one radial swim going around that cell point. There was just far less to kind of look at and observe within those areas. And so we were able to go a little bit slower and really cover the whole area with just one time around there. And then we also ended up adjusting a little bit in the field and performing some transect data. And this was after realizing that these radial swims and kind of the scattered nature of the tires wasn't necessarily going to be easy to try to quantify to get into any type of, good estimates of tire counts. And so the objective here was to really collect some quantitative data so that we could help extrapolate that and use that to help put together a good tire count estimate. And so we ended up doing those in the south side of the reef and then 2 in the middle there. It was the intent to complete another transect at the cell 13, which you can see on the northern side, but that was on our second day of field work. And unfortunately, we got stormed out with lightning and had to kind of abort the rest of the afternoon there. And so never got our cell 13 transect data, but I know these images here are a little bit hard to see in detail, but just to give you an idea of what that data ended up looking like, we were basically just running out a transect tape from one end of the tire reef to the other and doing a belt transect data collection to note how many tires we were seeing, what distance along the transect we were seeing them, and then also what groupings we were seeing, whether they were in groups of 3 or otherwise. Oh, and then we also did some modified RVC surveys to just get an idea of what fish were utilizing the tire reef. And so we did 2 of those, one on cell 5 and one on cell 10 within this kind of middle area of the reef here. And this is ultimately where we were seeing a lot of the heavy use and kind of denser tire area. So what did we see? A lot of the tires really ranged. They were definitely, some tires were very heavily covered in primarily sponges and octocorals. Other tires had very little to no coverage. Almost all tires had some sort of sedimentation or silt layer and a turf algae layer. But the primary organisms that were encrusting the tires were sponges and octocorals. There were also some various tunicates, barnacles. We did have occasional hard corals out there as well. They were very few and far between. I think we had about 10 total between all of our cells that we, were in the water reconning, but you can see here that they did get up to, a decent size for a coral growing on a tire. Probably about 10 to 15 centimeters was our largest in diameter, was our largest coral we had. But then we did have a lot of them were quite small, less than 5 centimeters. We also observed kind of these emergent sponges and octocorals growing out of the sand. A bit of digging and probing there revealed that there were tires completely buried under the substrate there. And so there are obviously some buried tires that, we weren't necessarily counting. Most of the benthic habitat otherwise, though, outside of any tire growth, was just sort of this coarse sand and shell rubble. There wasn't any seagrasses or really any other benthic habitat of, significance among the tires. It was really just growth being observed on the tires themselves. And then interestingly, there were some of these, what we were suspecting were kind of tire pits. And so that's the image in the bottom middle there. And so it was sort of these darker sand signature areas that looked to be about the length of a tire that potentially a tire may have been dislodged from. And so just some more images here. You can see in the upper right-hand quarter, this is what some of the denser areas of the tire reef looked like. Again, there's no stacking of the tires, and most of the tires are kind of situated in that grouping of 3 half buried and with spacing in between them. Again, we had a handful of hard corals that we observed, but very few of them overall, and then a slew of different fish species that were observed kind of utilizing the area. So looking at the tire conditions and getting into our count estimates, again, we were seeing tires in primarily the groups of 3. They were about 91% of our observations based off of that tire transect data that we collected, but we were also seeing some groupings of 2 and 1 tire, indicating that, you know, these were becoming separated and dislodged from the initial deployment grouping of 3s that were set out. We also saw some tires in pretty degraded forms. You can see in the bottom right here, almost completely shredded. And so again, just kind of highlights the concern here for these tires degrading and further leaching those, you know, toxins into the water, and then also becoming dislodged and dispersing throughout the adjacent area. And so with kind of our transect data and diver observations, we were able to extrapolate what we observed in our limited kind of representative recon cells to the larger main field area and scatter field area. And so overall, we're estimating that there's about 8,000 tires out in the reef, most of that being along the main reef area, but obviously there is some scattering primarily to and confirmed on that kind of west side of the main reef area. We also sort of adjusted specifically the main reef area here, primarily on the east side, just based off of some of our observations. And so just a slight adjustment from what we had picked up from the Bathy data, but we went ahead and updated that. And so now that we have all of this data, we're working on putting together a remediation plan or restoration plan for this tire reef specifically. And we're looking at, you know, some other aspects and components to help tie into that larger plan. And so we're obviously looking at reference projects of other tire reef, just projects in general and removal efforts. I'm sure a lot of folks here are familiar with the Osborne Reef in Broward County. That's been a big one over the last few decades. And so looking at that one, there's been some efforts in Palm Beach. Pinellas County is currently working on putting out a RFP for some tire reef removal on the Gulf side of Pinellas. And so we're really just kind of reviewing these projects for lessons learned, what strategies and methodologies are being utilized for removal, so we can make, you know, adequate recommendations in this plan. Part of the pre-app discussions for part of our scope of work was to, you know, hone in on the environmental permitting strategy. The project in general will be, whether it's, you know, removal, enhancement, whatever it may be, will be some sort of restoration and or debris removal project. The agencies seem to be pretty on board with that, and that removal of the tires would be restoring the benthic habitat back to what before, you know, deployment and before these artificial substrates were introduced into the area. We did a desktop coastal condition review of just, you know, some of the coastal conditions that the site experiences. And so this was just very high level, but we did look at storm paths, prevailing winds and waves. And so those prevailing winds and waves did highlight that the direction that they were coming from would make sense for that tire reef to have shifted to the west a bit, and presumably mostly from recent hurricanes, specifically Helene and Milton back in 2014. But again, these are just kind of general observations and data from available sources and not really kind of like the site specific level of detail, but, you know, give us some sort of indication that the movement that is likely being seen may be from some of these parameters. We also looked at water quality data within the area. There is a sampling station near the artificial reef that has determined the water quality is pretty healthy in the area. but there is a higher than average concentration of organic compounds at this site, as well as heavy metals. So that may be due to some degradation of the tire-based reef materials there. And so we're kind of pulling all of this information together to look at different options for remediation. And so we have three options that we're sort of looking at a little bit closer and go into a bit more detail in our plan. But the first obvious option is just removal of the artificial reef. So the objective of this one would be to restore the site to pre-deployment conditions, which is, your predominantly bare and sandy substrate. Why it largely reduces the benthic habitat or ecosystem functions that are being provided by the tire reef. It does eliminate kind of the long-term environmental risk and concerns that are posed by these materials. And so with removal, though, there are some disadvantages, there's some cons maybe to consider. Specifically, the high cost for these projects. Removal of these tires is very expensive. And then obviously there will be some significant site disturbance getting these tires out of the ground. And so removal of these materials may at least temporarily heighten the kind of contaminant and leachates that come from the tires during that removal process. And there's just some of the things to consider for this option. And then obviously getting these tires onto land, you then have to consider waste management and disposal of those tires. Another option we're looking at is what we're referring to as enhancement or encapsulation. And so both of these are sort of an enhancement approach. The former option, enhancement, being a perimeter stabilization approach. And so the idea here is to implement some stabilizing materials of more suitable and a bit more natural habitat. So things like riprap or prefabricated modules, such as larger reef balls, to help contain the boundaries of the more dense tire reef areas. And so we've identified those areas in sort of the line hatching that's shown in this map. There's two areas that kind of hold the majority of the tires on site. And so if we were to implement the perimeter stabilization approach, the idea is that we would install these materials in kind of these thin green lines on the side of each of those areas. And so this helps address some of the concern for dispersal and dislodgement of the tires, especially the ones that are in this more dense area. The idea is that we want to keep them there. This could also be supplemented with some hybrid approaches of removal of easily accessible and scattered tires that, are maybe already dislodged and are within that scatter field area. And so this helps maintain some of the ecological function that the habitat or the tire reef is providing, even if it is limited, and does help contain that dispersal, but it does not necessarily prevent the contaminant leaching, and would have to be designed effectively to ensure that it would also prevent, 100% dispersal, depending on design conditions. If you have a huge storm that comes through here, the perimeter stabilization approach is only going to be able to do so much. The second kind of option to be, if you will, here is encapsulation. And so this is what we're referring to as the surface cover approach. And so this is basically just burying or capping the existing tire reef, specifically, again, focusing on those tire dense areas. And that would be with materials such as riprap or concrete debris of opportunity, and would likely look something like the green hashed rectangles, like I mentioned, and the whole hash area would essentially get that capping material, probably a geotextile layer before that, the larger material that would be placed on top. And then ideally, obviously, we would want to sort of model extreme storm conditions to make sure that material does withstand some of that those storm conditions and prevents, further movement from the materials that we're placing on top there too. So again, this helps with the dispersal concern. You could also add in some easily accessible removal for the scattered field while you were out there deploying these materials. And then while it would temporarily, because essentially you would be, burying the tires that have that epibiota growth on them, you would temporarily be removing that ecosystem and those functions, but the area does show that, if there is substrate, you can have that ecological function. And so the idea would be that those organisms and cover would start to come back and provide that reef habitat again. Again, with the enhancement or the perimeter stabilization approach, this does not necessarily eliminate the concern of leaching, though. So the tires will likely continue to disintegrate and degrade. They will just be kind of kept in place by the cap material there. And then option 3, continued monitoring. This is really only a interim solution. And so if you're looking at emphasizing documenting the current conditions in a little bit more detail to get a better understanding of what the specific reef is doing, how it's moving, a structured monitoring program could help you do that. But with that, you may ultimately want to end up addressing some of these longer term ecological concerns then. And so it's really a matter of, how many resources do you want to put into this option 3 before you maybe have to revert back to option 1 or 2 in the future anyway. And so this is just sort of a summary table here. In short, if your primary goal is restoring the site to pre-deployment conditions and eliminating those long-term environmental concerns, then option 1 is going to be your most definitive option there, but it is one of the most resource intensive solutions. And so if your primary goal is maybe enhancing or maintaining the ecological habitat that is there, option 2 lets you do that. And then option 3 is more appropriate, as I said, as an interim or an adaptive management strategy where maybe we don't have the resources or the funding available right away. And so this allows us to continue to collect data to make a more informed future decision when it does come time to make that decision. And so as you can see down here in the right-hand corner, I just highlighted kind of the 3 sort of main things that need to be considered when making a decision with which path to move forward on. And so the idea here is that we'll go into all of these in quite a bit more detail in our plan, and then ultimately provide some, dollar amount estimates to help TBP come to a decision as to which one they want to move forward with when weighing their kind of different priorities and goals for the site. And that's all I have. So happy to take questions if we have time, or I have contact info there if we don't.
I think in the interest of time, you can take the 2 questions that are already in the chat, Rebecca. And
Okay.
before we kind of go to the next speaker, I did want to mention we're reviewing the restoration plan now, so we'd love feedback from the community on what y'all think about these different options. And Rebecca wasn't able to get into one of the objectives is we wanted to get kind of angler perceptions on the tire reef. So Blake, our social scientist, and I are working on putting together a survey to get at that aspect of the project as well.
Okay, so I can go ahead and take these couple of questions that are in the chat. The first one from Brandon, are you pursuing permits to remove the tires under the scope also in the pre-apps or disposal requirements discussed, like landfill acceptability, etc.? And so under our current scope, we're not pursuing permits. It was limited to just the pre-application meetings. And so if TBP were to move forward with specifically options 1 or 2, we would have to get permits to move forward with that. During the pre-apps, the agencies were very adamant about having as much construction methodology information as we can, both during removal or enhancement, as well as what any of that material disposal would look like after. And so encouraged to get as much information as we could to be able to submit for their review. I think with permitting, they would likely, I don't think you would have to identify the landfill beforehand. Before you get the permit, you would just have to submit a landfill for approval before you were to commence the construction activities for the agencies is typically how that works. But to your point, they may have to go to a landfill that accepts kind of contaminated material depending on what their thresholds are there. The next one from the Water Management District, you identified the ridge at the beginning of your presentation. Might this be related to the tires reducing energy in the immediate area, allowing sediment to settle at a great rate in surrounding areas? We did consider that because that ridge, if you recall, kind of extends so much further beyond the tire reef to the north and south and kind of wraps around almost on that south side. We just weren't sure if the tire reef itself, being such a small scale of the overall linear footage of that ridge, was the main driver for causing that ridge. So I'm not sure entirely. And then if so, your option 2 may actually promote additional sedimentation of the tires that are still exposed, or at least of either the more difficult tires to be removed and those that have a tire occurrence of sponges, hard corals, life in general. And so, yeah, with the option 2, we would definitely suggest additional coastal modeling and design to really see what that sediment transport was going to look like, especially if we were adding additional materials within that area, and specifically because of that grade differential from one side to the other, right? We wouldn't want to drastically impact the sediment accumulation within that area. So that's definitely something we would recommend taking a closer look at before we introduce more materials and more relief within that area. And then one more here. What impacts have been documented as a result of the tire reefs that are driving this investigation? And Carrie, feel free to add to this. But I think overall, it's become pretty well known that these artificial tire reefs can leach contaminants into the water, affecting organisms that may be utilizing the area, also the water itself and substrate. There have also been sort of reportings or findings of tires washing up on shores, on the beaches in the nearby areas. And so it's kind of assumed that these tires may be coming from these tire reefs, whether or not this one specifically, the other ones that are also kind of along the coast here. Kara, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think that's about right. We found this tire reef. Yeah, Maya just put it in the chat. We found that during the original side scan mapping, and we wanted to look into that. And then to your second question, Becky, this tire reef was initially involved with the No Marine Degree grant, but it got separated from that just because it was inshore and in shallower waters, and wanted to do a little more detailed investigation on what the impacts would be on removal and remediation. So, yeah, like I said, we're reviewing this restoration plan right now, so feel free to reach out to Rebecca or myself if you have any comments or suggestions on, what we should include in this. And I think I'll go ahead and go to the next presentation. I'm going to be starting that one out. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Let's see. So this project that I'm going to be talking about is involved in a working group that I've been leading over the past couple of year and a half. And we're actually going to be presenting one of the draft products from that working group. So just to give you all a little bit of background on what this working group is about, it's through the Gulf Ecosystem Initiative. That QR code goes specifically to our project if you want more information on what we're trying to do. And it's a program through the National Center for Environmental Analysis and Synthesis. Basically, their idea is to bring together experts to solve problems using existing data. So this is a project we got through this Gulf Ecosystem Initiative, and we wanted to look into reviewing the impact of estuarine habitat restoration on fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico. So myself, Angela Collins from Florida Sea Grant, and Blake Simmons are leading up the project. And Hallie Rapetta, who's going to be talking later, has been our restoration database lead, along with Grace Stringer. And just to give you kind of an overview, the overall project, the end product is going to be a data synthesis, looking at a variety of data sources that are available. And we want to look and see if can we assess restoration effectiveness for fisheries through these long-term data sets. So bringing together habitat data, fisheries data, shellfish data, socioeconomical data, and information on restoration projects, which is what we'll be talking about today, and environmental and climate data. So we wanted to look at, intertidal and subtidal habitats that are being restored, their proximity to large-scale restoration projects. And this is a Florida focus, but it's intended to be scalable if these methods work. So the working group makeup, we brought together a bunch of different experts in the field, including coastal ecologists and restoration practitioners, fisheries ecologists and managers, and also social scientists, so that we have a broad range of experience and input on what data would be useful in the project. And we basically got together in Santa Barbara, where NCEAS is located, did a lot of facilitated work group sessions to get down to a few products that we thought would be really useful for the community. And so what we came down to is some major projects that we wanted to complete within the 2-year period to evaluate the impact of restoration on fisheries. The first 2 are systematic literature reviews of published research, looking at what type of outcomes are being measured during restoration projects and how they may impact fisheries, what evidence there is for that. The second is bringing together restoration data from a variety of different databases, notwithstanding the National Estuary Program database that we oversee, and seeing if we can get get that all in one place. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And then using that data to inform an analysis of long-term data and comparing that to fisheries. So I'm going to go ahead and give the mic over to Hallie, where she's going to talk about the restoration database that we put together.
Awesome.
And just tell me when you want me to go forward on the slides, Hallie.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Carrie. And yeah, given the sake of time, we're going to do a very brief overview. A lot of these slides have a little bit more information than I'll probably be diving into, but I'm happy to answer any questions about anything specific at the end. So yeah, as Carrie mentioned, I'll be talking about the restoration database that we've been building for the last 1.5 years. And I'm going to do a general overview and walk through briefly the 5 different phases and stages and where we're at right now. So the first stage, it was the data set compilation, and this resulted with 11 different data sources that include publicly accessible databases, agency maintained project platforms, and internal data sets requiring direct request for access. And I'm sure these are very familiar to folks on this call.
So while we're going through this presentation, we're going to ask for feedback from everyone. So you can go ahead and bring up this Mentimeter. And I'll be going through a couple of questions so that we can get feedback on this. So the first question. Come up, go. You can either scan the QR code, or you can go to menti.com with this code in here. Blake, would you mind putting the Menti link in the chat for me? So our first question is, are there any data sources for restoration projects that we're missing? So if we go back to this slide here, we've got a pretty large amount of data sources that we brought in. So if you can think of anything else that might have some information on restoration projects that we can bring into this database, that would be really helpful. And just as an aside, when we have brought together all these different databases, there's been a lot of duplication, and Hallie's going to go into that quite a bit. So we may have some of these already in the database. Okay, you guys can continue to put your answers in there. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the presentation so Hallie can continue talking about the project.
Awesome. So moving on to the second stage of database development is what I'm calling data pre-processing stage. And this included the standardization of variables across all of the data sources. And it also included manually filtering out projects that fell outside of the scope of the database, which would be examples would be projects that were funded only for the planning and design of a given restoration project because the funding for the actual physical restoration occurred with a different funding amount. So that's an example of that. And I've included here some select, not all of them, of the standardized variables that we're looking at. So we have some quantitative metrics. Majority were recorded in acres restored. But we also had area protected, and also some databases had socioeconomic metrics such as number of jobs created. So we retained those as well. In terms of restoration characteristics, we categorized into habitat type, restoration technique. And then with funding and implementation, we were able to incorporate total project cost, funding source, funding recipient and or implementer, associated legislation with that funding, and any funding amount that came directly from the legislation, and any partners listed. And in terms of general metadata, we really focused on completion year and latitude and longitude. All right. So the third stage of the development is data refinement, which has three different components that I'm going to briefly walk through. And the first component was to review the compiled database and identify any key missing variables across each of the original database sources. and then try to compile those missing variables. So this was done in a variety of ways, but through manual extraction from supplemental PDFs, data mining from supplemental documents, and also just in-house requests for additional information that was not provided on a public-facing platform from that original organization. And this was really valuable because it enhanced our resolution on just under 1,000 projects, which is really great. And I do just want to give a quick shout out in particular to one of our team members that works with FWC's Artificial Reef Program. And so we had originally about 320 or 27, I think, artificial reefs that fell within our estuary region, but they did not have a comparable quantitative metric associated with them. And he and his team were able to calculate artificial reef footprints for about over 90% of them. I think it was 297 of those 327 projects, which is pretty incredible. And we're really excited to have that because that really enhanced our ability to look at these types of things. And the second component of the data refinement stage involves standardizing the inputs of some of the select variables in order to better quantify these in analyses. So we standardize the actual variables, but some of these we standardize the inputs. So for example, we standardized habitat type and restoration technique, and that was informed based off of the categories that we are utilizing in our literature reviews and data extraction, which were informed by the NEP protocol and EPA protocols. And we also, and you can see that it's an example of a subset of them on the table on the left. And then we also categorize main funding source and lead implementer variables into the categories federal, state, local, nonprofit, NGO, private, academic, mixed partner, other, and unknown. All right, and the third component of the data refinement stage involved the handling of duplications of projects, and this was pretty tedious and a lot of trial and error, but we ultimately resulted in a hierarchical three-tier approach, and I'm going to quickly run through this. So for tier 1 and tier 2, we applied the general methodology of developing a duplication key, which allowed us to cross-reference possible duplications within data sources and between original data sources in our database. And of those potential duplicates that were identified, these were all manually reviewed, and either these both records were retrained, they were either merged into a single composite record, or a record was fully removed if it was redundant. And we documented all of our justification for whatever action was implemented for each of these records. And as you can see on the right, there's a little table matrix there that just kind of shows the potential duplications that were identified, sets of duplications that were identified in the tier 1 approach. And the tier 1 included a duplication key of anything that had the same matching project name, project description, latitude, and longitude. And from that first round, you can see a little over 1,000 sample rows were identified as potential duplicates, and that was over 459 potential sets of duplicates. So those were all reviewed, and we removed about 443 rows or projects from that. And then the tier 2, and this was focused on, that tier 1 was focused on those very obvious duplications where maybe a project was funded from multiple sources, and we have databases representing those given sources. And so they'd be matching pretty exactly, or it could be from human error from like inputs. We're able to move some of those too. And then the tier 2, we just had a duplication key of project name. And this was to focus on some of those more ambiguous situations, in which case maybe one of the one database didn't have a project description section, and so that wouldn't have been caught in that original round. Or maybe there's different levels of decimal points required for inputs for a given project across different data sources. And so this was to kind of focus on capture those. So as a whole, this tier 1 and tier 2 resulted in a 53% reduction of rows, and which equated to about 11% reduction in our full database. And then briefly, we also are focused on tier 3, and this was the final tier of the process, and it involved a manual review of select subsets of records, focusing on complex multi-year and multi-component restoration projects. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Robinson Preserve, and this is like a great example of what we're looking at, which is this table on the left just pulls all the projects that have the term Robinson Preserve in them, or Robinson, I think. No, Robinson Preserve. And you can see that a lot of them, like some data platforms like NEP, they record every restoration activity that occurs and are very specific in recording the actual action or the phase, whereas some of the other platforms that we were pulling from might have just had Robinson Preserve as a single sample. And so we want to make sure this is really important to remove, because when we're thinking about quantifying like acreage over time and over area, we really don't want to be having duplicates of those values when we're working with like such large projects. And that leads to our next slide and next Menti question is that we'd love to ask if you guys are familiar with any large-scale estuary restoration projects that we should consider for that third tier manual review.
All right, you can go back into that same Mentimeter, and the second question should have come up. So if there are any other large scale projects we should specifically hone in on for looking for that deduplication process that Hallie was talking about. We have talked about terracea and rock ponds already, so plant bio is a good addition too. Thank you. All right, so we'll go ahead and leave this question open as well. So while Hallie goes through some of the summaries of the database, if you think of anything, feel free to continue to add answers into the Mentimeter.
Awesome. So this brings us on to stage 4, which I call data refinement. And the team discussed pretty heavily if we wanted to have spatial considerations and for the database. And given that we want to focus on those estuary impacts, and projects, we decided to develop a spatial boundary that was composed of a marine spatial layer, which was FDP's estuary nutrient regions, except for a select polygons based on expert opinion, and combining that with an inland spatial boundary that was composed of all of Florida's coastal counties and any overlapping USGS HUC 10 watershed boundaries that intersected with those coastal counties. And you can see an example of that compiled shapefile on the right. All right, and so just to review, stage 1 data set resulted in about 1,400 samples from our compilation stage. Stage 2 brought that down to about 4,500 project samples. The data refinement stage, which was focused on that deduplication effort, brought that down to just over 4,000 samples. And with our data set finalization, which was applying the spatial boundary filtering, that brought us to about 3,600 project samples. And I'm going to talk about stage 5 in the next couple slides. So here is a map on the right with our shapefiles and all of the locations of our project samples that were included, which, as I mentioned, is about just over 3,600. This was compiled from 10 different data sources and had a completion year ranging from 1964 to 2025. And something unique is that we're able to link 11 different forms of legislation tied to these different projects. And on the table on the bottom left, the graph shows the number of projects per data source, and we can really see here how important the NEP reporting is, and how important the amount of projects it represents in our database. And this is something Carrie and I have talked about, and it's really valuable because they've been reporting their reporting dates go much farther back to than some of those federal databases that we're pulling from. So it's really great to compile all these informations.
Will, just to answer your question while it's in the chat, the NEP database doesn't include mitigation restoration, so I would assume that that's probably a data gap here. And I'd just also like to say good job on reporting to our NEP database. So just goes to show you how important that information is.
All right, so we're gonna just gonna quickly run through a couple of preliminary results, focusing on projects that occurred within the Tampa Bay watershed, and just to demonstrate some possible pathways of exploration with our database results. And so we ended up using, for the following analyses and figures, we ended up using 569 habitat restoration projects because we excluded any maintenance projects in there. And on the bottom left figure, this represents the number of projects per habitat type. So you can see that uplands has a very high representation in this subset of data, along with freshwater wetlands, estuary shoreline, salt marsh, mangroves, aquaculture. And yeah, so these two figures can demonstrate some temporal analyses. So the figure on the left represents total acres restored and total projects completed per year in the Tampa Bay watershed. The teal bars represent acres restored and are associated with the left y-axis, and the blue line represents the total number of projects completed, and it's associated with the right y-axis. And then the figure on the right follows the same format, except that the light blue bars are now representing the total restoration investment for all of those projects in a given year, and that's in millions of dollars. These next figures look at the number of projects by habitat type over time. So the figure on the right represents the number of projects by habitat type per year in the watershed from our database. And it's pretty cool because we see a very similar pattern in the figure on the left, which is from the Tampa Bay Estuary Program's Habitat Report Card. And this is to be expected because a lot of the projects in this subset are coming from NEP database, but it is really cool to see, and that's a validation in itself. And the project numbers are slightly different here because, as I mentioned, we're not including maintenance projects here, whereas this figure does include maintenance projects. Then this next slide, we can also look at and leverage looking at the funding and seeing who is funding these restoration projects in the watershed and also who are the lead implementers. So with these pie charts, the left is main funding source and the right is lead implementer. And as you can see in the orange, local stakeholders play a really important role both with funding restoration and implementing restoration in the area. The state stakeholders too, which encompass regional districts in our categorization, are also really, really valuable, and they're in the light purple. So you can see, local stakeholders are representing about 30% for both funding source and implementer. And then with implementer, we also have a really high percentage coming from nonprofit and NGOs. So this is really interesting to look at. And we're really excited to leverage this data and kind of explore this funding and linking this to the habitat types and everything moving forward.
And just to add a little bit to what Hallie was saying, obviously a lot of this funding overlaps. So some of the federal funding may be passing through to state and local um, governments as well. So we're still trying to figure out how to look at that in a thoughtful way. But it's really interesting to be able to have all this information in one place.
So we are really excited to continue our work, and some of these include like conducting a comparative analysis of the literature review derived and also restoration database derived results and doing some side-by-side comparisons. We've also, as already mentioned and talked about, using this database to conduct some data synthesis to evaluate the impact of restoration on estuary-dependent fisheries. And our other primary goal is developing an interactive public-facing platform. And within the restoration database, I'm looking to do some additional analyses on spatial and temporal hotspot gaps and analyses. I'm looking at the drivers and characteristics of restoration projects and looking at funding distribution and policy and legislative influences. And lastly, something we're trying to look into right now as well is trying to link restoration in relation to human context. So maybe doing some spatial overlap with MREP fishing effort and population density. And we have some experts on our team that are going to be really helpful and see like what's feasible and what's not with that. But that's a really interesting angle that we're going to try and explore as well. All right, and so we have our last three Mentimeter questions.
I'm going to go ahead and go over to the Mentimeter, and that's basically we're going to ask you three different questions, talking about what metrics you're interested in, what functions you would like to see in an interactive database, and then finally, ranking the type of data analysis that we're going to be doing. So that's some of the things that Hallie talked about here, whether you're interested in spatial or temporal trends, the characteristics of restoration projects, whether it's large versus small projects or relationships between cost per acre and habitat type, things like that. So I'll go ahead and move over to the Mentimeter and we'll run through those questions as well. And if you have any additional questions about the database, feel free to chime in. Here's our first question. This is a ranking exercise. Which type of these metrics would you be most interested in seeing in an interactive database? What we're hoping for is this database will be useful for you all as a community. So make sure to get your input in here and feel free to reach out with any additional um, comments or suggestions to either myself or Hallie. We'll give another 2 minutes for folks to get their responses in since this is a ranking one. Well, you'd be glad to know that the order of interest here um, definitely matches up with what we uh, considered as a work group as well. We had similar questions that we asked to the folks on the working group. So there's a question here, does the database shown include habitat restoration pre-2005? Yes, it does. I think you had a graph up there. What was the oldest project? Was it in the 1960s? Is that
I
right?
think it was 1964, and that was just from completion date. So we also had a variable with start date, which we're focusing on completion date for our analyses. But I think some of the start dates date that didn't have a completion date even farther back.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and move to the next question. And this is a free answer. So this is basically, what kind of functions would you like to see in an interactive restoration database? So once we get this all put together, what would you like to search for? What would you like the functionality to be?
This is really, really great feedback. Thank you all.
The one question about post-restoration monitoring, that's been something that we were definitely interested in. And that's what we're trying to get at with the literature review. So, we're looking through published literature and agency reports on, outcomes that were measured after restoration projects and trying to match them up. All right, I'll give everybody another minute to get in their suggestions, and we'll move on to the last question. Hallie, while we're waiting for the last couple responses, do you want to give everybody an idea of what the most common variables that we were able to get with all of the different data sources?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, let me pull that up. But project for metadata, I think 97% of our data had latitude and longitude coordinates, which was really great. And actually, I think that might have been like 92%, but there were some other ones that had county. And so we were able to identify what county was associated with that for still will be able to be used for some of those analyses. And so between county and lat longs, I think we had like 97 or 98%. Habitat type and restoration technique were really high in the 90s, as well as, let me pull up that list right now.
So those would be the things that would be really easy for us to bring up in an interactive database.
And most were acres restored. There was also miles restored and feet restored, but majority were acres restored, and some additionally had acres protected as well. But majority were in acres restored. We also had, I think, total project cost. Those are in like the 50, 60 percentile from my memory. Funding source and funding, I think, was in like 80%, and implementer was in maybe like 60%. So over 50% for some of those more variable ones, which was really great to see. But the primary ones that we have really high percentage compiled on was that previous question, I think, that you laid those out. So I'll be able to achieve that.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the last question. This has to do with what types of summaries and analyses you would like to see that interests you the most. Hallie gave a couple of examples, but I kind of put it into different categories here, whether you're interested in the spatial or temporal analyses of restoration activity, what characteristics of each restoration project, whether they're large, they're small, what type of habitats they're focusing on, funding, analysis of restoration in relation to human context or some of the social ecological measures, and then evaluation of policy and legislative influences. So this is another ranking one, so I'll give you all some time to go over this. While you guys are ranking that, I'm going to go ahead and give you a little reminder of um, entering your own restoration data. So that's our next slide here. So reminder that our annual habitat restoration reporting is going to kick off here. All your submissions for restoration projects that were completed within the last federal fiscal year will be due by the end of July. The data entry portal is open year round, so feel free to enter it when you have those data available. As you saw from this presentation, the data that's collected during this push is really important and was responsible for the majority of the data that we're analyzing. So make sure you get that information into us. I'll go back to the summary here. And then finally, as you guys are finishing up on this ranking, before we sign off, I wanted to remind everyone that our next meeting date is August 26th. That's another virtual meeting of the Habitat Restoration Consortium. And then we have an in-person meeting on December 2nd. This is tentatively at Weeden Island. I'm working with them. We may have to change the date depending, but for right now, it's December 2nd. And as always, if you have any themes that you'd like to see for the Habitat Restoration Consortium meetings or workshops that you'd like to see us put on, please reach out. We also had the potential for maybe doing our own kind of, volunteer events. So if folks would like to do that instead of a meeting, let us know or give us some suggestions. Does anybody have any questions for Hallie before we're ready to sign off? Or for any of our other speakers? All right, thanks everyone. Feel free to sign off and we will see you next time.